Welcome to Long Road to the Vote, Suffrage Centennial Lecture Series. This year-long series commemorates the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment. Tonight's panel on historical perspectives on women's suffrage, Rhode Island and Beyond is the third of 4 exciting programs we have planned this semester. Tonight's presentation will start with a short video about our series. History is a central humanities discipline, and the centennial of the 19th Amendment is a critical milestone in American women's and political history.
The history of suffrage in the United States is complex, but we, the people, do have the tools within our power to make the changes that can move us forward.
For history students to be able to see what an important role Rhode Island played in fighting for women's suffrage, I think is going to really influence the way students think about social movements.
Especially with this past election, we've seen what a relevant issue voting rights is. It's definitely refreshing, but also important to listen to actual experts who have been in this field share their expertise.
Reminds us that these issues are not over and that they still need strides to kind of overcome some of the barriers.
As we started our planning, we realized that 2020 was not only the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, granting American women the right to vote, but also the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment, which at least nominally enfranchised Black men, although it took another century for that right to really be realized.
My students had the opportunity to analyze a primary source document from 1916. The document is from Rhode Island, a resolution in favor of women's suffrage, or the Susan B. Anthony Amendment as it was called back then.
And we just kind of wanted to find out, who they were, where they were born, where they were from, what they liked to do, and these women, their stories weren't told, and now they are.
It's important to learn about the suffragists and their motivations and exactly what they were aiming to do.
We hope people will walk away with an appreciation for the importance of the humanities, for interpreting current events and understanding the world we live in. Good evening and welcome. I'm Eve Stern, Director of URI's Center for the Humanities, and tonight's panel on historical perspectives on women's suffrage, Rhode Island and Beyond, will feature in this order historian Elizabeth Stevens from the Newport Historical Society, historian Elisa Miller from Rhode Island College, and political scientist Emily Lynch from URI. We'll have questions and answers after the talk, so please type your questions into the chat at any time. I'd now like to welcome Dr. Kathy DeCesare, a professor in URI's Department of History and an expert in Rhode Island and women's history. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you, Eve, and thank you for inviting me to introduce the scholars this evening. I will be introducing each panel member as they present. It is my great pleasure to introduce our first guest, Dr. Elizabeth Stevens. Elizabeth Stevens is currently the editor of Newport History, the scholarly journal of the Newport Historical Society. She recently edited and contributed to The Bridge. This publication is a combined issue of Newport history and Rhode Island history, and it exclusively focused on women's suffrage in Rhode Island. In addition to her editorial responsibilities, Dr. Stevens wrote an article which examined the Newport Women's Suffrage Convention of August 1869. Additionally, she authored a book entitled Elizabeth Buffum Chase and Lily Chase Wyman, A Century of Abolitionism, Suffragist, and Workers' Rights Activism. This noted biography details the lifelong activism of this mother and daughter dynamic team. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Stevens.
Thank you, Kathy. (1869) and 1870 were fateful years for women's suffrage leadership in Rhode Island. In December 1868, Paulina Wright Davis and Elizabeth Buffum Chase, two dynamic, influential women's rights advocates, initiated the formation of the Rhode Island Woman Suffrage Association. Both Davis, who was in her mid-50s, and Chase, who was 65 years old, had been active in anti-slavery and women's rights reform for more than 30 years. Just months later, in the spring of 1869, the fledgling women's suffrage movement split into two opposing factions. The New York group, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, opposed the passage of the 15th Amendment, which ensured the vote for Black men, but not for any women. The Boston group, led by abolitionist veterans like Abby Kelly Foster and Lucy Stone, supported the 15th Amendment. This rupture in the movement reverberated in suffrage leadership in Rhode Island when Paulina Wright Davis allied with the Stanton-Anthony wing of the movement. Her close friend and Reform colleague, Elizabeth Buffum Chase, affiliated with anti-slavery colleagues in the Boston group who supported the amendment. Davis resigned the presidency in November 1870 of the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association, and Elizabeth Buffum Chase took over as head of the organization for the next 30 years. Recently, I've been trying to decipher whether the anti-slavery, anti-racist beliefs of Chase and other older abolitionist colleagues permeated Rhode Island women's suffragism in the 1870s, as these veteran reformers entered an entirely new reform milieu. The 1870s and 1880s witnessed an explosion of national women's activist groups with the local and state counterparts in Rhode Island. Hundreds, even thousands of middle-class women moved out into public activism. Groups like the highly organized Rhode Island Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in 1875, exemplified the new reform scene. The new women's organizations did not just stick to one issue only, as the anti-slavery activists had before the war. The WCTU members, for instance, advocated for prison reform, police matrons in city jails, women's suffrage, and protection for women workers, among other reform initiatives. Our traditional narrative for the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association in the last decades of the 19th century has been a small group of white women battling heroically against fierce opposition on behalf of women's voting rights, with their petition drives, pushes for legislative hearings, and annual meetings with stirring speakers. Yet suffragists were inextricably part of the larger women's movement in Rhode Island, and the larger movement included suffrage activity. While I have been searching for any strands of abolitionist DNA that survived in the Rhode Island suffrage movement into the 1870s, I have begun to look not just to Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association records, but also to other Rhode Island women's activist groups of the period. A powerful women's association that was initiated at this time was the Rhode Island Women's Club. Founded all over the country in this era by professional women, journalists, writers, and teachers, women's clubs provided an opportunity for networking and for intellectual growth. I've often likened the clubs to universities without walls, where women of all ages who had never attended college prepared papers and discussed and debated on topics of current events, social problems, history, science, art, literature, and other subjects. An affiliated national group, the Association for the Advancement of Women, started up in 1873. The AAW sponsored an annual Women's Congress with delegates from all over the country, where women speakers presented papers on economics, philosophy, and science, and other topics. Although the women's clubs did not at first embrace suffrage as a movement, their leaders were often ardent women suffragists who hoped that participation in the clubs would convert non-suffragists to the cause. The Rhode Island Women's Club was an example of the tightly woven connections between the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association and other women's groups in the state in this era. It was founded in Providence in 1876 by suffragist and writer Elizabeth Kittredge Churchill. Born in 1829, Churchill was a generation younger than Elizabeth Buffum Chase and Paulina Wright Davis, and other Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association founders. Widowed with 3 grown children, Churchill was a gifted speaker, writer, and organizer. She supported herself by teaching gymnastics and writing columns for the Providence Journal and giving public lectures. From the inception of the Woman Suffrage organization in Rhode Island, Churchill was deeply embedded in the women's suffrage fight in the state. She served on the executive committee of the Suffrage Association while also working as its organizer, canvassing the state, lecturing, and promoting local chapters of the Women's Suffrage organization. After Churchill's untimely death in 1881, a fellow suffrage activist asserted that the Rhode Island Women's Club was Elizabeth Churchill's child, and that temperance, suffrage, and the interests of working women were dear to her heart. The first president of the Rhode Island Women's Club was Churchill's fellow suffragist, Sarah E. Doyle, also a younger, self-supporting activist who was a legendary teacher and principal at the girls' department of Providence High School. She had taken leadership roles in the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association since the early 1870s. Sarah Doyle went on to spearhead a successful campaign for the admission of women to Brown University. Neither Churchill nor Doyle carried anti-slavery DNA, like suffrage leader Elizabeth Buffum Chase. By the mid-1870s, leadership in Rhode Island's women's movement was shifting to younger women who were new to public activism. A look at the institutional records of the Rhode Island Women's Club leadership, with its strong links to the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association, reveals a disturbing incident that took place in 1887, the year after the Rhode Island Women's Club was founded. To be admitted to the Rhode Island Women's Club, one had to be proposed for membership. The board of the club then voted on whether to admit each proposed member. This appears to have been a pro forma process until December 1876, when an African-American woman named Elizabeth H. Smith was proposed for membership in the club. Elizabeth H. Smith had been a teacher at the Meeting Street School in Providence, a segregated African-American school prior to school integration, which happened in 1865. She had been at Meeting Street School for several decades. Born in Providence, in her youth, Elizabeth Smith had attended the famed but short-lived Prudence Crandall's Seminary for Young Ladies in Canterbury, Connecticut. She served as principal at Meeting Street School well into the 1870s. A well-respected and skillful teacher, Smith presented curricular demonstrations on spelling to her fellow educators at the Rhode Island Institute of Instruction. Her successful teaching at the Meeting Street School led segregationists to argue that the quality of education under her leadership was so high, there was no need for school integration, since Meeting Street School outperformed some of its peer schools in the Providence system. Elizabeth Smith also worked with George Downing and others for the desegregation of Providence schools. She supported the admission of Maricha Lyons, an African-American teenager, to the girls' department of Providence High School in 1865. And I don't have an image of Elizabeth Smith, but I do have Maricha Lyons, and the picture of her as a young woman is perhaps a little younger than she was when she entered the Providence Girls High School. The picture that I have of her as a somewhat older woman was when she was remembering Elizabeth Smith. And I wanted to read a couple of things that Maricha Lyons wrote about Elizabeth Smith. Maricha Lyons later herself became a famed teacher, suffragist, and Black rights activist. She recalled that Elizabeth Smith, quote, loved learning not only for learning's sake, but for the privilege it gave her to aid in developing the mental growth and mental strength of young people. Maricha Lyons remembered Elizabeth Smith's, quote, disciplined mind and varied reading, her animated, graceful manners, and her kind heart. The secret of her popularity was that she was equally a good talker and a good listener, Maricha Lyons later explained. Although the board of directors of the Providence Women's Club, headed by Elizabeth Churchill, was usually prompt in response to the proposal of new members for admission, at its January 1877 meeting, the Women's Club board voted that The name of Mrs. Elizabeth Smith, a candidate for membership, after discussion, was laid on the table for 6 months. Elizabeth Buffum Chase, also a member of the Rhode Island Women's Club, was outraged by the failure of the board to promptly admit Elizabeth Smith to membership. Chase's first response was to propose that the club's constitution should be amended to allow members to protest and even overturn decisions of the board. While considering Chase's proposal, the directors voted that membership in the club could be denied by one blackball vote. Chase then resigned as a member of the Rhode Island Women's Club in March 1877. Chase later expressed her anger and dismay in a letter to Elizabeth Churchill the next month. Board member Fanny Purdy Palmer, the leader of the opposition to Smith's membership, had declared that, with her, it is a principle that people of different races should not mingle together. Palmer was a published writer and active reformer who had joined the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association months after its inception. She held leadership roles in the suffrage organization in the 1870s and 1880s. Like Churchill and Doyle, Palmer was several decades younger than Elizabeth Buffum Chase and had no history in the anti-slavery movement. Chase informed Churchill that Palmer's position derived from, and I'm quoting, a prejudice born of the oppression of one race by another, which has produced its legitimate result of hatred of the oppressed by the oppressor. Further, Chase argued that it was the duty of club women to help Palmer learn, quote, the injustice of her position towards the colored people of this country, now become bone of our bone, flesh of our flesh. What was devastating to Chase was the betrayal of women in the Rhode Island Women's Club leadership who claimed to be lifelong abolitionists, yet, quote, who sacrificed their principles to please those who shared with Mrs. Palmer her prejudices and relentlessly trampled under their feet a person of colored skin, unquote. Apparently, a few other women also resigned from the club in protest, yet a number of suffragists remained on the board and as members. On October 3rd, 1877, more than 9 months after her name had been laid on the table, Mrs. Elizabeth Smith was voted upon and was rejected. Regrettably, Elizabeth Smith's voice is missing from this brief account of her unjust treatment by the suffrage activists who also held leadership roles in the Rhode Island Women's Club. Elizabeth Buffum Chase, the older co-founder of the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association, was drawn from the ranks of abolitionist veterans, and she was unable to abide explicit racism. She and fellow anti-slavery activists had broken with their reform friends and colleagues over the issue of the 15th Amendment 8 years before. Yet younger Rhode Island suffrage activists appeared to have had no qualms about exhibiting and condoning racist behavior. They were perfectly willing to accommodate such activity in their organizations in order to build membership and avoid dissension. Even older suffragist abolitionists were apparently were willing to tolerate injustice. It is not clear how the outcome of this affair informed Chase's leadership of the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association in the ensuing years. She wrote that it caused her more pain than I would ever voluntarily incur again. 2 younger women who would follow Chase as chair of the executive board of the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association in the 80s and 1890s, Anna Aldridge and Mrs. S.E.H. Doyle, sister-in-law of Sarah Doyle, the educator, were both active in the Rhode Island Women's Club when Elizabeth Smith was denied membership. In constructing the Rhode Island women's suffrage narrative in the last decades of the 19th century, it is necessary to expand beyond the strict confines of assessing Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association activities only, as valiant as they may be. I would argue that we must view the women's suffrage effort in the state within the context of other activist women's organizations, some of which also worked for women's suffrage. The emergence of colored women's clubs in the 1880s is part of the women's suffrage narrative in Rhode Island. Dynamic Black leaders like Newport's Mary Dickerson, who is in the back row in the middle in this image, started the Women's Newport League in 1885 and went on to promote Black women's activism on a state, regional, and national level. 20th century Rhode Island suffrage activists like Bertha Higgins and Mary Jackson, who came up through the ranks of the colored women's clubs in the early 20th century, eventually proved an essential part of the Rhode Island women's suffrage effort as Rhode Island women pressed for the vote in the first 2 decades of the 20th century.
Thank you, Liz. That was wonderful. So interesting. Now it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Elisa Miller. Elisa Miller is an associate professor of history and the chair of the department at Rhode Island College. She is an expert on U.S. women's history with a particular emphasis on the Rhode Island women's suffrage movement. She also recently published an article in The Bridge. In her essay, Dr. Miller wrote about ordinary Rhode Island women and how they pushed, lobbied, and agitated for the right to vote. Additionally, Dr. Miller serves as the Rhode Island State Coordinator of the online biographical dictionary of the women's suffrage movement in the United States. This innovative project focuses on women's suffrage between the crucial years of 1890 and 1920. Collectively, these biographies contribute to a better understanding of this complex social movement. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Elisa Miller. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here today. It is heartening to see the women's suffrage movement get increased public attention as a result of the 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment last year. Too often in the past, women's suffrage has been treated as a marginal issue in American history, in education and the media, given a token day during Women's History Month or a side box in a history textbook. As Kathy mentioned, I'm the Rhode Island State Coordinator for the online biographical dictionary of the women's suffrage movement. Here on my first slide, you can see the website for it if you want to read some of those bios of Rhode Island women or national women. Otherwise, you could also Google it. The increased attention to the suffrage movement comes at a moment in American society when we are much more conscious of the racism that has been embedded in American society and history, including the women's suffrage movement. As a result, much recent examination of the women's suffrage movement has emphasized the themes of racism and white supremacy in suffrage, themes that were in fact present in the movement, as Elizabeth just discussed. In classes, popular press articles, Twitter, and blog posts, though, a new narrative seems to have become common, that women's suffrage was led by white women for the benefit of white women, and that the 19th Amendment for women's suffrage only provided voting rights for white women. Here is an example of a 2019 article from Teen Vogue that emphasized that idea. This is a false narrative and one that erases Black women as important actors in the history of women's suffrage, particularly in the early 20th century. Both nationally and here in Rhode Island, Black women were active members and leaders in the suffrage movement. They supported it for reasons that were specific to their race. They were critical to achieving the 19th Amendment, and they used the voting rights gained in the 19th Amendment to assert power and influence in local, state, and national politics in subsequent years. Part of the reason that Black women historically have been missing from suffrage narratives is that leading white suffrage organizations largely excluded them from the movement and later in histories of the movement. NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the largest and most influential suffrage organization with state branches across the US, had no Black leaders. The vast majority of its members were white, and many state branches either explicitly or implicitly excluded Black women. Besides being activists, NAWSA very consciously documented their history. And for example, this is a 900-page book that they published on the history of women's suffrage just in the years from 1900 to 1920. In these 900 pages, there are a handful of sentences about Black women in suffrage, and none of the women or organizations that I'm going to talk about here today appear. For much of American history, scholars, politicians, activists, and the public overlooked Black suffragists and privileged the history of white leaders and organizations. Prominent scholars have published important work examining the suffrage activism of Black women, but much of this has not permeated the public consciousness. In addition to these slights, the efforts of Black suffrage have also been neglected and misunderstood because they often took different forms than those of white activists. White women usually participated in local suffrage organizations affiliated with NASA with the central focus on suffrage, or they participated in broader reform groups such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union, in which suffrage was an important goal, and the WCTU had a lot of overlap with NASA in terms of goals and membership. Black women nationally in Rhode Island, though, primarily participated in and supported suffrage as part of the Black clubwoman movement. Black women's clubs developed across the country in the late 19th century as Black women organized to protect African American communities at a time of intense racism and discrimination in the nation. They sought to improve the lives of Black individuals, families, and communities through civil rights work, education and employment training, public health initiatives, Christianity, and respectability politics, among others. By the 1890s, the Black clubwomen founded the National Association of Clubwomen, the National Association of Black Clubwomen, the NACW, that connected these local Black clubs into a national network. By the turn of the century, suffrage became an important part of the Black clubwoman movement, but as part of its broader racial uplift agenda, not as the sole goal. These clubwomen believed that Black women could use the right to vote to further their reform goals to improve the lives of African Americans and fight against racism. They believed that Black women had special talents and responsibilities to improve racial conditions in the US. Because Black suffrage efforts were embedded in these women's clubs and not suffrage-specific organizations, historians often did not include them as part of the suffrage history, and therefore the support and influence of Black women has been dismissed. Rhode Island at the turn of the century had an active and thriving Black club movement. By the 1910s, there were approximately 20 individual Black women's clubs across the state, such as the Women's League of Newport, as in this first photograph, and other clubs such as the Sojourner Truth Club, the Women New Century Club, and many others. By 1903, the local clubs joined together to form a state organization, the Rhode Island Union of Colored Women's Clubs, that was also affiliated nationally with the NACW. The Rhode Island Black Women's Clubs actively supported and worked for women's suffrage by the 1910s. At their meetings, the club women discussed, listened to speeches about, and voted on resolutions about women's suffrage as an important step in advancing the interest of Black Americans. Here are a couple examples that show the work of Black club women on suffrage in Rhode Island from the Providence Journal. Here we have two articles, one from 1911 and one from 1913. The first one, Colored Women Seek to Check Prejudice and Demand Suffrage Rights. This is from an annual conference of the Union of Colored Women. Colored women want the right to vote. This was a meeting to discuss whether Black women should form their own suffrage organizations. An especially important Black suffrage leader in Rhode Island was Bertha G. Higgins. Unfortunately, right now, I have not located a photograph of her. She was an active leader in a variety of Black clubs in Rhode Island. She regularly gave speeches to Black audiences in locations such as churches and mothers' clubs about the importance of women's suffrage to African American women and African Americans broadly. In one speech, she argued that Black women would make an important difference in American society, claiming that, quote, the colored ballot of our mothers, wives, and sweethearts will purify, unquote, society on issues such as immorality and alcohol. In 1913, at the annual convention of the Rhode Island Union of Colored Women, Higgins led a debate titled, Why the Rhode Island Union Should Endorse the Suffrage Movement. Following this discussion, members voted to pass a formal resolution in support of the women's suffrage movement. In 1916, she organized with another Black women's club this suffrage minstrel show that was primarily a fundraising event, but also brought awareness to the cause of women's suffrage in Rhode Island. Another prominent Black suffrage leader in Rhode Island was Mary E. Jackson. As with Higgins, she was active in the Black club women movement and for many years served as the president of the Rhode Island Union of Colored Women. She also served as vice president in the Alpha Suffrage Club, the influential Black suffrage organization led by Ida B. Wells in Chicago. She also headed the suffrage department of the NACW. In 1915, Jackson participated in a forum dedicated to women's suffrage in The Crisis, which was the magazine of the NAACP. In her essay, Jackson argued that working women especially needed the vote to protect themselves and that anti-suffrage objections were, quote, protest against progress, civilization, and good sense, end quote. In other essays, Jackson argued for Black women's suffrage, claiming that the Black woman, quote, must be made to know she is no longer a ward of America, but a citizen with the rights, duties, and responsibilities of citizenship, end quote. Here you can see another short article from the Providence Journal from 1915, where Jackson, as both a suffragist and the president of the Rhode Island Union, was sitting on the dais for a suffrage event, a lecture by Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, the former president of NASA. This article also shows reports that Jackson's Rhode Island Union was among the first state organizations to endorse women's suffrage. As mentioned in the intro, in 1916, Mary Jackson led the members of the Rhode Island Union of Colored Women to endorse a petition in support of the federal women's suffrage amendment that they then sent to the US House and Senate. And I'm very eager to see the bios that the URI students have written on these signatories. In addition to the work of Black women in the women's clubs, many of them were also members of the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Party. This Rhode Island suffrage organization was affiliated with NASA and was very unusual in that it was an interracial suffrage organization with Black members and leaders as well as white ones. Most suffrage organizations across the country were primarily segregated by race, including the major Rhode Island suffrage organization, the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association, that later was renamed the Rhode Island Equal Suffrage Association. Both Bertha Higgins and Mary Jackson were prominent members of the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Party. Jackson represented the party, giving a high-profile speech in 1914 at Roger Williams Park. There was a day-long activities in support of Women's Independence Day, and she gave a speech about women's suffrage to a large public audience. Within the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Party, Higgins led suffrage efforts specifically aimed at African-American audiences. Black suffragists collaborated with white suffragists both within the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Party and at times with collaborative events with other suffrage organizations in the state. A prominent example took place in 1919 when a group of suffragists, including Black women, and Bertha Higgins was one of them, met with the Rhode Island governor, Livingston Beekman, to lobby him to support a special legislative session to ratify the 19th Amendment. This photograph is from the Providence Journal and shows the suffragists posing with the governor on the steps of the Rhode Island State House that day. The Rhode Island General Assembly and the governor ratified the 19th Amendment in January 1920. The day the governor ratified the amendment, Rhode Island suffragists held a huge party. Besides suffrage leaders and members, guests included dignitaries, including the governor, the mayor of Providence, leaders of the state Republican and Democratic parties, and others. This was a huge celebratory event after 50 years of hard work by the Rhode Island suffrage movement. At the party, though, Mary Jackson gave a speech in which she reminded the audience of mostly white suffragists and politicians of the critical work that remained to be done to achieve racial equality. Suffragist Sarah Algeo described Jackson's words at this event as, quote, a flaming sword about the wrongs that must be righted among our colored brothers and sisters, end quote. It was an important reminder from Jackson that the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage was not the finish line for Black women, and that much activism, reform, and legislation was needed to continue the fight towards racial equality. Jackson, Higgins, and other less prominent Black suffragists and club women continued civil rights activism in the years after 1920 and the 19th Amendment. They made significant and effective use of their newly won voting rights. Black women in the South were quickly disenfranchised through Jim Crow laws and intimidation, as Black men had been in the late 19th century. And they only earned formal voting rights in 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. However, in the North, Black women became important and savvy political actors. They were active in political parties in Rhode Island and nationally. Initially, they were strong supporters of the Republican Party as both the party of Lincoln and one they saw as more supportive of Black voters and African-American civil rights than the Democratic Party. Local, state, and national politicians and parties realized they needed to court the vote of Northern African-Americans, particularly as their influence and population grew in size due to the 19th Amendment and the Great Migration of African-Americans away from the rural South to northern urban centers in the early 20th century in hopes of securing better jobs, living conditions, and less racism. Higgins was active in Republican politics for many years before the 19th Amendment. By 1906, she was president of the Women's Auxiliary of the Frederick Douglass Republican Club. She continued her support of the Republican Party after 1920 and emerged as an influential political advocate. She founded and served as president of the Julia Ward Howe Republican Women's Club, a Black women's organization with the goal to recruit Black women into the Republican Party, support Republican candidates, and lobby Republican politicians on behalf of African Americans and their concerns. U.S. senators and congressmen from Rhode Island courted her support. Higgins' work with the Republican Party attracted national attention, and Warren G. Harding, who was elected American president in 1920, wrote her a letter thanking her for her work for the Republican Party in the 1920 election and invited her to his inauguration in Washington, D.C. Bertha Higgins grew up a poor Black child in the rural South in the years immediately following the Civil War. Her parents were most likely former enslaved people. Now, due to her political influence as a Black woman, the president-elect of the United States was indebted to her. By the late 1920s, Higgins became frustrated with the Republican Party and its lack of action on civil rights issues. By 1932, she ended her relationship with the Republican Party and shifted her political activism to the Democratic Party and its candidate, Franklin Roosevelt. Here we have a flyer of Higgins speaking alongside of white political leaders in Rhode Island, including governors, mayors, senators in 1934. As we examine and commemorate the history of women's suffrage, it's important that we pay attention to the significance of Black women in suffrage, as well as the distinctive reasons and ways that they participated in the movement. Rhode Island Black women's organizations and leaders such as Higgins and Jackson worked hard for women's suffrage, saw it as critical for the advancement and protection of African Americans against racism and inequity, and wielded significant political power in the years following the ratification of the 19th Amendment. We must not overlook or erase their role in the suffrage movement in the name of examining the white dominance and racism of much of the women's suffrage movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisa. That was great. That was so interesting. Next, we're going to welcome our colleague, URI political scientist, Dr. Emily Lynch. Emily Lynch is a lecturer in political science. Her teaching and research interests include political psychology, public opinion, Congress, and political communication. She has published in the Journal of Communication and Political Behavior. As a congressional fellow for the American Political Science Association, Dr. Lynch worked for Rhode Island Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, and she researched education policy at all levels. Dr. Lynch is currently working on a book about Rhode Island politics and government with URI Professor Emerita Maureen Moakley. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Emily Lynch.
Thank you to Evelyn and Catherine and the rest of the organizers of the Suffrage Centennial Lecture Series. I am honored to be a part of this panel alongside Elisa and Elizabeth. I am going to take a more contemporary approach to discussing women as candidates and as office holders in American politics. So let me get started. So the first thing that I want to share with you is the important finding that when women run for office, women win that office. And it's interesting when you're looking at election results, you see that women tend to do just as well as men, and some studies have shown women do better than men when they are running for office. And we see over time, and this is data looking at from 1988 through 2020, that there has been an increase in the number of women who have won seats in Congress. And this is both for Republicans and Democrats, although you see that Democratic women are a larger portion of this trend. So this is, in a very optimistic view that this is great data. We have another record year of women who are in Congress. It may be a little more disheartening when we look at the total percentage of women out of the whole composition of Congress. When we're looking at 535 members, it's only 26% at this point. If we look at that comparatively across countries, the United States is ranked 104th in a recent ranking of the percentage of women being a part of the lower house. And there are some reasons because of this, and we can get into that in a little bit. But I also wanted to share with you that we have, although women are winning, women are not running for office at the percentage that we would like to see in order to reach parity. This is showing data based on the U.S. Senate, U.S. House, as well as statewide executive office. This is from the Center for American Women in Politics from Rutgers. And this is showing that if we look at, for example, the U.S. House, you have 29% of the candidates who ran for a House seat being women. So why don't we see many women candidates? Well, there are a number of reasons, and let's get into them. Let's begin with the ambition gap. So what we see with the ambition gap is that women are not planning to run for office. We see this with young adults. We see this with surveys that have looked at college women versus men, and college women are not interested in, and they report that they're not as thinking about seriously running and getting into politics. There have been studies that have looked at school board members as well as city council members, and the vast majority of women are not interested in running for higher office. They're happy to be in these local positions. So there's the ambition gap of women not being interested in running for higher office. We also see a confidence gap, which is related to the ambition gap, right? So we can see the confidence gap of women underestimating their qualifications, even though when we look at the women who are in office, they tend to be more qualified than men. So why is this the case? Why aren't women confident? Well, the studies show that women tend to internalize their failures and externalize their successes. Men are the opposite. So men tend to engage in more risky behavior, and risky behavior includes running for office. So we see this trend with all women if we look at all different subgroups, that this confidence gap exists. And it became more apparent when there was this idea of a pipeline theory, that once there's an increase in the percentage of women who become lawyers or become leaders in business, then you'll see an increase in women running for office. And it just didn't pan out the way that it should have been based on the numbers that we see now in those occupations. So the second point here is recruitment. So historically, women have taken the back seat in political parties when we're looking at women tending to take on the volunteer roles, or there's little emphasis by political leaders, political elites, to develop female leaders. And this perhaps is changing, where we have seen more groups that are demanding that there are more women running for office, both Republican and Democratic sides. So you have Emily's List, you have Maggie's List, that are trying to recruit women to run for office. There's a recent study, though, that showed that donors, if you're comparing Republican versus Democratic donors, they're less aware, Republican donors are less aware that there are those groups out there like Maggie's List that are trying to recruit women, conservative women. So there needs to be more of an awareness if we want to reach parity and on both sides. So another important part of recruitment that we want to consider is that about 25% of the consultants out there are women. So we need more Kate Coyne-McCoys, who is on a previous panel, to go out and recruit women to bring in different perspectives. The final point that, or excuse me, one of the next point is we have a concern about family constraints with women. And there have been some studies that have shown that if you have the women mayors that across the board are less likely to be married or have children under the age of 18. You have had studies that show that women feel discouraged to run for office because of family responsibilities. Women will run for more local seats because it's closer for them to be able to juggle family responsibilities. Although this may be changing, and there's some positive research out there suggesting that family constraints may not be as important today. And then the final point here of why we don't see more women candidates is just simply the legislative structure of our system, where we have single member districts that lead to this two-party system and an incumbency advantage. So you tend to see more women running for office when you have an open seat, and more likely for that woman candidate to win. So we have to consider the legislative structure. And especially when I was giving that comparative data of us ranking at 104th comparatively with other countries have some other countries have proportional representation, gender quota lists. So there are these institutional structures set up that allow for women to an easier path to office. So we've talked about why women may decide not to run for office. What are some of the reasons behind that? Let's talk about some common perceptions of women and men candidates. And let's begin with candidate traits. Well, we tend to see that voters perceive women candidates to be more compassionate. So that means that women are perceived to be more moral, honest, ethical, as well as compassionate. For men, they are perceived to be tough and better able to handle a crisis. So it's important to note that voters tend to value the masculine over these feminine traits. But it's also important to note that voters will evaluate traits based on their pre-existing views. So let's give the example of Hillary Clinton in 2008. She's in New Hampshire and she gets teary-eyed. So if you're a Democrat, then maybe you think, oh, this is her compassionate moment. But then if you're a Republican, you're thinking she's weak. She's a weak, candidate. So it really depends on, you have to think about what the pre-existing views are of these voters. As for issues, women tend to be seen as being more competent in healthcare and education, and which would be what you would maybe assume to be the more compassionate type of issues, versus men, where there is an emphasis on the economy and the military, that's where voters perceive that men candidates are going to be stronger leaders with the economy. So, but really what some of the studies have shown is that, well, what's the most important issue during that election? Is it that we're in an economic crisis, or are we seeing major healthcare changes, right? So there's we have to think about the context, right? You can't just consider simply the candidate issues as and the gender of these candidates. It's also important to note that a woman candidate's ideology is often overestimated as being liberal. So who is that going to affect the most? That is going to affect a Republican woman candidate in a conservative district in the primary, right? So if the view is that a woman, just based on her gender, is going to be more liberal, that will hurt her there. So we have this concern when we're looking at perceptions of candidates of this double bind, where women candidates have to walk that fine line of trying to show themselves as being both masculine and feminine. If they want too much of one or the other, then voters are going to negatively evaluate them. There are some, an example of this would be Republican Senator Joni Ernst, who was able to show herself as a mother, soldier, and also being clear about her ideology. So that's another thing, is that you, as a women candidate, you have to be clear about what you stand for. All right, so we know what the perceptions are between men and women candidates. Well, do these matter when people are going out to vote for these candidates? It depends, right? The research is mixed here, where there is some research that, recent research that suggests gender stereotypes really don't matter that much. What matters the most is party ID. Party ID trumps everything else. Another line of research is based on this leaders not ladies theory, where women are first evaluated as leaders, and next, like the second priority is of viewing them as ladies based on their gender. And if you have a lot of experience, you're a women candidate, then your gender may not matter with this particular theory. But I think it's important for us to also consider where we have seen these stereotypes where they may matter, and we have to consider the role of the media. And there's been some really interesting research that shows how the media can frame campaign stories with gendered stereotypes. And this particular research comes up with 4 categories of stereotypes, including women candidates as sex objects, as a mother, pets and children, an iron lady. And a good example of this, let's take one like the mother, the research was showing and comparing how Hillary Clinton was perceived by what the framing was within the media of her as being a scolding mother versus Sarah Palin being a spunky mom. So you have these different gendered stereotypes that you see within the campaigns. And it's really important to also consider how these framing campaign stories, how it affects women of color. And the studies have shown that women of color are put in these even narrower frames of these stereotypes. And women of color are doubly disadvantaged. The majority of studies have shown that as candidates because of dealing with both racism and sexism. So going back to the overall role of the media, the studies have also shown that women receive less coverage and more negative coverage overall. So we also have to consider, well, what type of media platform are we receiving our news from? Because there all have been studies that have shown that in this local newspapers, there have been no gender differences in speaking about these candidates and how they are framed and what stereotypes are used, that there wasn't any difference between how women and men candidates were covered. There wasn't any negative coverage, more negative coverage. And as for level of politics, the study that I just mentioned was based on congressional races, where perhaps in some ways we have seen women candidates become more normalized versus the presidency. We have yet to have a woman president. That is something that the media is portraying and really carefully scrutinizing, and not carefully, they're scrutinizing based on these framing of the gender stereotypes. Okay, so why does it matter that women are in office? So let's talk about representation in a few different ways. And we're going to begin with descriptive representation. So we have here, that's kind of circling back to what I showed you in the beginning of my slides, of the differences in gender among the 117th Congress, where we have 26% of the 535 being women. And you can see the breakdown of in the Senate as well as in the House. And then we have 49 women of color in the 117th Congress. And it's also important to note that we've had one U.S. congressional member, Claudine Schneider, who was in Congress in the 1980s. So we've only had one woman in Congress. So let's now look at some descriptive data of women in state legislatures, and we'll do some comparisons of other states versus Rhode Island. So we have overall 30% of state legislatures comprising of women, 7.5% women of color. By party, the majority of women in the state legislatures are Democrats. We can look at the top state as being 58% women in Nevada, bottom state 11%. We should be proud of this. We have the third top amount or percentage of women in the General Assembly at 45.1%. So let's break that down a little more, where we have the 45%, as well as we can look at 9.7% women of color. We can break it down based on the House and the Senate, as well as leadership. And there's, we can look at leadership and in a few different ways, but I'm just using the top 5 leadership positions in the Senate and the House and the General Assembly for that first leadership stat. And then you have for committee chairs, 9 out of 28 are women. We can look even closer or even at a lower level of local politics. So we've looked at federal, state. Now let's look at the local level, where we have 36% of the city and town councils being women. When we look at leadership of being chair or vice chair, we have 12 leaders, mayors 3. And we can also look at the moderator, manager, administrator positions, and we have 3 out of 24 who are women. So let's move on. And so we've done some, I've showed you a little bit on descriptive representation. So what are women doing when they are in office? What are they standing for? What are their priorities? Are they representing women as a whole? And the research in political science is suggesting that yes, there are gender differences in priorities of men versus women, but we can look at it at different levels, right? And we should be looking at it based on state, local, and federal level. But here I have the example. This is from Folden, Wiseman, and Whitmer's work from 2018, where they looked at congressional data, and based on these 19 categories and prior research that suggested some of these categories are women's issues and should be coined women's issues, they broke it down and they found that indeed most of what the literature said before of women's issues are bills that more women are statistically significant in that there are more women introducing these bills than men. So you also have a difference in leadership style, where women in local offices have been, and there have been studies at the local level, women are more likely to bring in a diversity of views. They are more collegial, and this was at the local and federal level. So you have more, they're also more likely to speak up and talk about women in when they have speeches. And just overall, when you have women in office, it offers a broader range of experiences. There is some data, though, in the congressional literature that suggests there aren't any gender differences in bipartisanship, on co-sponsorship, bipartisanship on procedural votes, and whether or not a member has moderate ideology for final passage votes on substantive issues. Why is that the case? You know, why would that be the case? The main, well, I guess there's 2 points here. The high level of polarization that we see in Congress right now, that relates to it, that you would have men and women office holders at the same level. And then secondly, the way Congress is set up is highly reliant on parliamentary procedure. So that's, I guess, not reliant, but that's the structure. So that has an effect as well. And then finally, we have not only descriptive representation and substantive representation, but also symbolic representation. So it is important to have women in office because of this role model effect. When women see other women in office, that can increase their idea that it is a legitimate idea for them to run for office, right? That it's okay. It normalizes women's presence in politics for young boys and girls, for young women and men. There have been studies that have shown that evaluations of women members are more positive from women constituents. Women constituents have a better idea of who their members are and what their voting records are if they have women as their representatives, and women become more engaged and talk more about politics and discuss politics. They have a higher interest in politics. It spurs young girls into political engagement. And I think it's important to note, when we saw if any of you watched the State of the State address with Governor Raimondo, a lot of what she said really resonated, and she focused on her as governor as being this important role model for younger women and to get involved in politics. So I think it's important for us to consider the impact that women have as office holders in American politics. So if you're interested, I have references up here. You can email me and let me know if you have any questions about these references. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. That was awesome. I'm going to welcome now Eve back to moderate the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, Elisa, and Emily, for 3 great presentations, and to Kathy for your introductions. We're now going to move on to questions and answers, and we have both some pre-recorded video questions from URI students and some great questions in the chat.
And hello, my name's Aaron Hertzer. I'm a senior here at the University of Rhode Island, graduating this spring, and I'm majoring in mechanical engineering and German, and then I'm also minoring in physics. I'd like to thank the panelists here for being here to answer our questions and talk to us about women's suffrage in Rhode Island. And my question for the panel was, where did Rhode Island's women's suffrage movement essentially start? Was it from the national kind of movement that was brewing around this time, or was this started somewhere else? Was there an event that took place in Rhode Island that kind of caused a domino effect? And were there any other movements even before the national kind of push back in the early 1900s that, doesn't get kind of see the light of day, that we don't hear about, that happened in Rhode Island? So that was my question, and thank you so much.
I'm going to defer to Elizabeth there, since she is the expert on the 19th century suffrage movement in Rhode Island.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for the question. That's a very interesting question. I'm just trying to think about how to answer it. The women's suffrage movement in Rhode Island really came out of an impulse of women, Chase and Davis, whom I talked about in my talk, who had been working in both in women's rights and in in anti-slavery movement for 30 years. And I think what happened in the aftermath of the Civil War, these reformers were trying to figure out a way to move forward. The anti-slavery activists wanted to make sure that the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments got passed, and the women's rights people wanted to move forward with their agenda too. So there was a period of a little bit of sort of confusion and after the Civil War, where people were trying to sort that out. And then I think, this the women's suffrage movement that started in Rhode Island really started as a result of women anti-slavery activists and women who had been working on women's rights deciding to form associations. And in the Rhode Island's case, it was the New England Women's Suffrage Association that started in Boston in November 1868. And the Rhode Island suffragists who attended, Chase and Davis, there may have been other people too, got so excited that they came back to Rhode Island, and using their kind of anti-slavery connections that they had, they sent out a call for a convention. And that's what really started the organization in Rhode Island. And there were about 1,000 people that came to the first, gathering to form that convention. That was in December of 1868. And then that organization was working right from the get-go on petitioning the legislature and trying to get suffrage on a state level. And I'll let that went on for the whole rest of the 19th century. And then Elisa can probably take it from there as to how it evolved.
Well, certainly it evolved away from those early roots, but I think to answer the student's question, both nationally and in Rhode Island, the connection between women's rights and anti-slavery were really important. And then, as Elizabeth talked about in her speech, by the turn of the century, the anti-slavery, anti-racist activists got replaced by newer people where that wasn't a priority for them.
Thank you so much. We now have a question from Rose Escamilla. Did the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association and Women's Club ever unite with the Women's Newport League?
Well, I think not as far as I know, but I think the story in Rhode Island nationally is that there were national networks of women's clubs all across the country, and there were Black ones and there were white ones, and there was the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, and then there's the General Federation of Women's Clubs, and one group was white and one group was Black, and they had similar interests, but it was a segregated women's club movement.
Thank you, Elisa. We're now going to have another video question.
Hi, my name is Annie Amal. I'm from the class of 2024. I'm a political science and history double major. I want to thank the scholars for hosting this panel discussion tonight. And my question for you is, in comparison to states such as Wyoming or Colorado, why do you think it took Rhode Island specifically so long to secure women's presidential suffrage, given its overall consistent smaller population?
Well, so, just to jump in, you say that Rhode Island, it took a long time to get women's suffrage, to get presidential suffrage. On the other hand, Rhode Island was a trailblazer on the East Coast, and they were the first state to pass presidential suffrage on the East Coast. So they were much slower than the Western states, but they were faster than all of their Northeastern and Southern counterparts. I mean, generally, I think the historians say that the Western states were newer, they were less bound to tradition, they had less established political parties, but also they had a real imbalance of male and female population, and they wanted to attract more women settlers, and women's suffrage was one way of doing that. But certainly women's suffrage progress was led by the Western states, and the Eastern states followed kicking and screaming.
Thank you, Elisa. We now have another question from Melanie Feliz. What do you believe was the main obstacle faced by the suffrage movement? How did this impact the women involved?
Well, I can just say in the late decades of the 19th century, just to give you an example, the most exciting thing that happened for the suffragists was in 1887, there was a state referendum on women's suffrage, and no women could vote on that. So it was men voting on whether or not women could get the vote, and they lost by a great amount. And I think that was an obstacle that women felt was very difficult. They tried a lot of different things. This is in the late 19th century. Elisa might have another perspective for the 20th century.
It's a really hard question, and there's many reasons. Just to quickly, I want to highlight two, that one, politicians and political parties were very wary of women's suffrage because it was a threat to the status quo. They feared that women might vote against their political interests, that business interest and women voters seemed to be at odds. So much like today, we see the Republican Party trying to support voting bills that would suppress the vote of African Americans. Political parties at the turn of the century feared that women voters would be a threat to their power. But also, I think that not just men, but also women profoundly feared that politics and voting was male terrain, and that women's suffrage would upend gender roles in society and the home. And that was very scary for many men and women. And the women's suffrage movement had to really struggle against those ideas and try to explain why that was not the case and to reassure people's fears.
Thank you. We now have a video question.
Hi, Professor Miller. My name is Miracle Dunn, and I'm a first-year psychology major here at URI. I was actually wondering if today you could describe your research to us and where you found the best sources to uncover the important African-American women's suffrage work in Rhode Island.
That's a great question. When you're studying Black people or ordinary people of any kind, you have to be a detective, and you look for them wherever you can find them. That can be the census and other government documents. The Providence Journal database has been really important to me. Studying other scholars and their footnotes. There is the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society in Rhode Island that has been collecting African American artifacts and documents for many years. Those collections have not recently been available, but we're very hopeful in the future that they will be. But you really have to be a detective and hunt wherever, because most of those club records were, not maintained.
Great. We now have a question from Shayna Weintraub for Emily. Does the fact that Rhode Island has only ever elected one woman to Congress, as well as only having one woman serve in the president's cabinet, have more to do with the population of the state or the way Rhode Islanders view women in leadership roles?
Great question, Shanna. I think we have to consider the population of the state, that we have so few congressional seats compared to other states. So I think that is a big part of the story. Another important part is this incumbency advantage, that we can look back at some of the senators we've had and congressional members, and some, since the 50s had served 20 years in office in the Senate, right, the U.S. Senate. So you have this incumbency advantage of continuing to re-elect those who are in office. As I talked about in my presentation, it's very difficult to break through that and to run against an incumbent, because the cards are stacked against you because of the fundraising that is needed, especially at federal level, the networking. And when you have someone who's been in office, has a war chest, it's much easier for them to get reelected and less of a chance for a woman to be elected to federal office in Rhode Island.
Thank you so much, Emily, and also to Elizabeth and Elisa for their responses. Thank you to our students who pre-taped questions and for audience members who asked questions. I'm so sorry we didn't have time to ask all of your great questions tonight. I hope that you all will join us for our fourth and final suffrage talk of this semester on Wednesday, April 21st at 7 o'clock, when Professor Pippa Holloway speaks about felon disenfranchisement and women's voting rights. Please visit uri.edu/suffrage for more information on this event or to watch past lectures from our series. Thank you and good night.